The morning sun was just breaking through the clouds as David Williams adjusted his tie one last time before grabbing his carry-on bag. His sister Lisa was already waiting by the front door, her medical bag perfectly organized beside her suitcase. They had been planning this trip for months, ever since their grandmother announced she wanted all her grandchildren together for her 90th birthday celebration in Los Angeles. "Can you believe Grandma Rose is turning 90?" Lisa said, shaking her head with a smile. "I still remember when she used to chase us around her backyard with that wooden spoon." David laughed, remembering those same summer days. "She's probably still got that spoon ready for us if we're late to her party." The ride to Atlanta's airport was filled with their usual sibling chatter. David, who worked as a lawyer specializing in civil rights cases, was telling Lisa about his latest victory in court. Lisa, a children's doctor at one of the city's top hospitals, shared stories about her young patients. They had always been close, supporting each other through law school and medical school, celebrating each other's successes. "I still can't believe you upgraded us to first class," Lisa said as they pulled up to the airport. "You know I would have been perfectly happy in coach." "It's Grandma's 90th birthday," David replied, pulling their bags from the trunk. "Besides, you work those crazy hospital shifts. You deserve to relax on this flight." The airport was busier than usual, with families heading off on summer vacations and business travelers rushing to catch their connections. David and Lisa made their way through security without any problems, stopping to grab coffee and magazines before heading to their gate. "Flight 447 to Los Angeles now boarding first-class passengers," the gate agent announced over the intercom. David showed their boarding passes to the smiling gate agent, who welcomed them aboard. As they walked down the jetway, Lisa was already talking about all the things they planned to do in Los Angeles: visit their old neighborhood, see their cousins they hadn't seen in years, and of course celebrate their grandmother who had raised them after their parents died in a car accident when they were teenagers. The flight attendant greeting passengers. At the airplane door was a woman in her 40s with blonde hair pulled back in a tight bun. Her name tag read, Jennifer. She barely looked up as David and Lisa boarded, giving them a quick nod before turning her attention to the passengers behind them. Their seats were in the third row of first class, and David was pleased to see they had plenty of space to stretch out during the 5-hour flight. Lisa immediately pulled out her medical journal, something she always did to stay current with the latest research. David organized his legal files, planning to work on a case during the journey. "Excuse me," Lisa said politely to Jennifer, who was walking by their row. "Could I possibly get an extra blanket? The air conditioning is pretty strong up here." Jennifer stopped and looked at Lisa with what seemed like annoyance. "We're still boarding. You'll have to wait until we're in the air." "Of course, no problem at all," Lisa replied with her usual kind smile. "I just wanted to ask now so I wouldn't forget later." Jennifer walked away without another word. David and Lisa exchanged a quick look. The response seemed unnecessarily sharp, but they had both learned not to read too much into brief interactions with busy airline staff. As more passengers boarded, David noticed something that made him uncomfortable. Several people walking past their seats did double takes looking at him and Lisa with expressions that ranged from curious to disapproving. One older man actually stopped and checked his boarding pass, as if making sure he was in the right section of the plane. "Did you see that?" Lisa whispered to her brother. "Yeah, I saw it," David replied quietly. "Let's just ignore it and enjoy our flight." But it was hard to ignore. A woman in her 60s, seated across the aisle, kept glancing over at them and whispering to her husband. Two businessmen in the row behind them were having a conversation just loud enough for David and Lisa to hear. "I don't know what this airline is thinking," one of them said. "First class used to mean something." "Times are changing," the other replied with a sigh. "Not always for the better." David felt his jaw tighten, but he forced himself to stay calm. He had dealt with situations like this before in his legal career, and he knew that reacting emotionally would only make things worse. Lisa, who had experienced her share of discrimination in the medical field, was also keeping her composure, though he could see the tension in her shoulders. The captain's voice came over the intercom, welcoming everyone aboard and giving the usual safety information. Jennifer and the other flight attendants began their safety demonstration, going through the motions of showing passengers how to use seatbelts and oxygen masks. During the demonstration, David noticed that Jennifer barely made eye contact with him and Lisa, while she smiled warmly at the other first-class passengers. When she walked by their row to check that seatbelts were fastened, she gave their section only a quick glance, not bothering to actually verify that they were buckled in properly. "Welcome aboard Flight 447, Jennifer announced over the intercom, as the plane began to taxi toward the runway. "We'll be taking off shortly for Los Angeles. Flight time today will be approximately 5 hours and 15 minutes. As the plane moved slowly toward its takeoff position, Lisa pulled out her phone to text their grandmother that they were about to leave. David was looking out the window, watching the other planes and ground crews, trying to push away the uncomfortable feeling that had been growing since they boarded. "I'm probably just being sensitive," Lisa said quietly, putting her phone away. "Maybe she's just having a bad day." "Maybe," David agreed, though he wasn't convinced. In his years as a civil rights lawyer, he had developed a keen sense for when someone's behavior crossed the line from merely unfriendly to potentially discriminatory. The signs were subtle but familiar. The plane reached the runway and paused, engines growing louder as they prepared for takeoff. David had always enjoyed this moment on flights, the anticipation of lifting off and heading somewhere new. Today, though, he found himself hoping that the rest of their journey would be smoother than the beginning. Jennifer's voice came over the intercom again, reminding passengers to turn off electronic devices and prepare for departure. As she walked through the cabin doing a final check, she moved quickly past David and Lisa's row without stopping, while taking time to chat briefly with other passengers about their travel plans. The plane began to move faster down the runway, and David felt the familiar sensation of takeoff as they lifted into the sky. Through his window, he could see Atlanta getting smaller below them, the buildings and highways becoming tiny patterns in the landscape. "Los Angeles, here we come," Lisa said, trying to recapture the excitement they had felt earlier that morning. David smiled at his sister, determined not to let anyone else's attitude ruin their trip to celebrate their beloved grandmother. But as the plane climbed higher into the sky, he couldn't shake the feeling that this flight was going to be more challenging than they had expected. 30 minutes into the flight, the plane had reached its cruising altitude and the seatbelt sign had been turned off. David watched as other passengers began moving around the cabin, some heading to the bathroom, others reaching into overhead bins to grab books or laptops. The businessman across the aisle had already pulled out his computer and was typing away on what looked like an important presentation. David had been hoping to work on a legal brief during the flight. It was an important civil rights case involving workplace discrimination, and he wanted to review his notes one more time before presenting it to the judge next week. His laptop was stored in the overhead compartment directly above his seat, just a few feet away. He waited for Jennifer to walk by, wanting to be polite and let her know what he was doing. When she appeared at the front of the first-class section, he raised his hand slightly to get her attention. "Excuse me," David said in his most professional voice. "Would it be okay if I got my laptop from the overhead bin? I have some work I'd like to catch up on during the flight." Jennifer stopped and turned to look at him, her expression immediately shifting to one of irritation. "Sir, you need to remain in your seat," she said loudly enough that several other passengers turned to. "Look, we're still in flight and it's not safe for you to be walking around." David was confused. He could see other passengers moving freely throughout the cabin. Just moments before, a woman from 2 rows back had walked past him to use the restroom. The man next to him had gotten up twice to stretch his legs. "I understand," David replied calmly. "But I noticed other passengers have been moving around. I just need to reach right above my seat." Jennifer's voice got even louder. "Sir, I need you to follow instructions. You're being difficult and I won't tolerate passengers who don't listen to crew members." Lisa, who had been quietly reading her medical journal, looked up with concern. She had never seen a flight attendant speak to a passenger this way, especially over such a simple request. "I'm sorry," Lisa interjected gently, trying to defuse the situation. "My brother wasn't trying to cause any problems. We've just seen other passengers moving around, so we thought it was okay." Jennifer turned her attention to Lisa, her face flushing red. "Ma'am, I don't need you telling me how to do my job. Both of you are causing problems on this flight, and I will not have it." The businessman across the aisle looked up from his laptop, clearly surprised by the flight attendant's aggressive tone. An elderly woman in the row behind them whispered something to her husband, both of them staring at the unfolding scene. David felt his heart rate increase, but he forced himself to stay calm. Years of handling difficult situations in courtrooms had taught him that losing his temper would only make things worse. "I apologize if there was any misunderstanding," David said carefully. "We're not trying to cause any problems. We're just traveling to see our grandmother for her 90th birthday." "I don't care why you're traveling," Jennifer snapped back. "What I care about is passengers following the rules and not disrupting other travelers." Lisa couldn't believe what she was hearing. In all her years of flying for medical conferences and hospital consultations, she had never witnessed such unprofessional behavior from airline staff. "Excuse me," said the businessman across the aisle, looking directly at Jennifer. "I've been getting up several times during this flight and you haven't said anything to me. These folks seem to be asking for the same courtesy." Jennifer whirled around to face him. "Sir, please mind your own business. I'm handling a situation with these passengers who are not following safety protocols." "What safety protocols?" the businessman asked, genuinely confused. "The seatbelt sign is off and people have been moving around freely." Jennifer's face was now bright red. She seemed to realize that her behavior was being noticed by multiple passengers, but instead of backing down, she doubled down on her aggressive approach. "These passengers," she said, gesturing toward David and Lisa, "are being disruptive and not following crew instructions. They're creating a safety issue on this aircraft." An older woman in the front row turned around completely in her seat. "I'm sorry, but I've been watching, and these young people have been nothing but polite. They asked a simple question and you're treating them terribly." Jennifer looked around the cabin and saw that several passengers were now paying attention to the confrontation. Some were even pulling out their phones. In today's world, everyone knew that airplane incidents could go viral in a matter of hours. "Everyone needs to mind their own business," Jennifer said loudly. "I am in charge of safety on this aircraft, and I will not have passengers questioning my authority." David and Lisa exchanged worried glances. What had started as a simple request to get a laptop had somehow escalated into a public confrontation. Lisa, who dealt with high-stress situations in the hospital every day, recognized that Jennifer was becoming increasingly agitated and unpredictable. "Maybe we should just forget about the laptop," Lisa whispered to her brother. But Jennifer overheard her. "No, it's too late for that. You two have already disrupted this flight and made other passengers uncomfortable. You're threatening the safety and security of everyone on board." David couldn't believe what he was hearing. "We're threatening safety? We haven't done anything except ask to get a laptop from the overhead bin." "Don't raise your voice at me," Jennifer shot back, even though David had been speaking in a normal, calm tone throughout the entire exchange. A young woman in her 20s, seated a few rows back, had pulled out her phone and was clearly recording the interaction. She wasn't trying to hide it. She held the phone up so that Jennifer could see. She was being filmed. "You're recording this?" Jennifer demanded. "Yes, I am," the woman replied confidently. "This is a public space, and what you're doing is completely inappropriate." Jennifer looked around the cabin and saw that at least 3 other passengers had their phones out, some recording video and others taking pictures. The situation was spiraling completely out of her control. "Put those phones away immediately," she ordered. "Recording is not allowed on this aircraft." "Actually, it is allowed," said the businessman, who was apparently well-traveled and knew airline policies, "as long as we're not interfering with crew duties or safety procedures." Jennifer looked frustrated and angry. She had clearly expected David and Lisa to back down and apologize, but instead other passengers were taking their side and questioning her behavior. "This is all their fault," she said, pointing at the siblings. "If they had just followed instructions from the beginning, none of this would have happened." Lisa felt tears of frustration forming in her eyes. She had worked so hard to become a doctor, dealing with discrimination and bias throughout her career. She had hoped that by achieving professional success, she would be treated with respect. But here she was, being humiliated in front of a plane, full of strangers over something as simple as asking for a blanket and trying to get a laptop. David noticed his sister's distress and felt a surge of protective anger, but he knew that showing any emotion would only be used against them. He had seen this pattern before in his legal work. When people with prejudices were confronted with their behavior, they often doubled down and became more aggressive. Brain. Tension in the first-class cabin was now thick enough to cut with a knife. Other passengers were whispering among themselves, clearly uncomfortable with what they were witnessing. Jennifer stood in the aisle, looking around at all the phones pointed in her direction, realizing that her behavior was being documented and would likely be shared with the world. What had started as a routine flight to Los Angeles had turned into something none of them could have predicted. Jennifer disappeared toward the back of the plane, leaving David and Lisa sitting in stunned silence. The other first-class passengers were still looking at them with a mixture of sympathy and shock. The businessman across the aisle shook his head in disbelief. "I've been flying for 20 years, he said quietly to David. "I've never seen anything like that." Lisa was trying to process what had just happened. As a doctor, she was used to dealing with difficult people in stressful situations, but this felt different. This felt personal in a way that made her stomach twist with anxiety. "Maybe we should just try to stay quiet for the rest of the flight," she whispered to her brother. David nodded, but he had a sinking feeling that this wasn't over. In his experience with discrimination cases, he knew that when someone's bias was exposed publicly, they often tried to justify their behavior by escalating the situation even further. Sure enough, 10 minutes later, Jennifer returned. But this time she wasn't alone. 2 male flight attendants walked behind her, both looking serious and official. One was tall and broad-shouldered, the other shorter but with an authoritative bearing. Jennifer pointed directly at David and Lisa as she approached their row. "These are the passengers I told you about," she announced loudly, making sure everyone in first class could hear. "They've been disruptive since the moment they boarded. They refuse to follow safety instructions and they're making other passengers uncomfortable." David felt his face flush with embarrassment and anger. Every word Jennifer was saying was a lie, and everyone around them knew it. But now she was making it official by involving other crew members. "Ma'am, sir," the taller flight attendant said, addressing David and Lisa with a stern voice. "We've received reports that you've been causing problems on this flight. We need to resolve this situation immediately." Lisa's medical training kicked in, and she forced herself to stay calm and speak clearly. "Officer, I think there's been a misunderstanding. We haven't caused any problems. My brother simply asked if he could get his laptop from the overhead bin, which is a normal request." "That's not what we've been told," the shorter flight attendant replied. "We've been informed that you were argumentative with crew members and refused to follow safety protocols." The businessman across the aisle couldn't stay quiet anymore. "Excuse me, but I witnessed the entire interaction. These passengers were completely polite and reasonable. The flight attendant was the one who became aggressive and unprofessional." Jennifer's face turned red again. "Sir, you weren't listening to the full conversation. These passengers have been difficult from the moment they boarded." "Actually, I've been sitting right here the whole time," the businessman continued. "I saw everything. These folks asked normal questions and were treated terribly." The young woman who had been recording earlier spoke up from her seat. "I have the whole thing on video if you want to see what really happened." Jennifer looked panicked at the mention of video evidence. "There's more to this situation than what you saw," she said quickly. "These passengers were assigned to the wrong seats. They don't belong in first class." David felt his heart skip a beat. This was a new accusation, and it was clearly false. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone, where he had saved the electronic receipt for their tickets. "Here's our boarding passes and receipt," David said, holding up his phone. "We paid for these first-class seats. Everything is legitimate." Jennifer barely glanced at the phone. "Sometimes there are computer errors. These seats were supposed to be reserved for other passengers." "What other passengers?" Lisa asked, genuinely confused. "The seats were empty when we sat down and no one has claimed them." I don't have to explain airline operations to you, Jennifer snapped. What I need is for you to cooperate and move to different seats. The elderly woman who had defended them earlier stood up from her seat in the front row. Despite being in her 70s, she had a strong voice and a no-nonsense attitude. This is absolutely ridiculous, she declared. I've been flying since before you were born, young lady, and I know discrimination when I see it. These people have done nothing wrong, and you're treating them shamefully. Other passengers began murmuring in agreement. A middle-aged man with his teenage daughter spoke up from across the aisle. My daughter and I have been watching this whole thing. These folks have been nothing but respectful. This is wrong, and everyone knows it. Jennifer looked around the cabin and saw that nearly every passenger was now against her. Instead of backing down, she became even more aggressive. All of you need to mind your own business, she said loudly. I'm in charge of this aircraft, and I will not tolerate passengers who think they can do whatever they want. We're not doing whatever we want, David said, his voice still calm but firm. We're sitting in the seats we paid for, and we asked one simple question about getting a laptop. That's it. Don't lie to me, Jennifer shot back. You've been aggressive and intimidating from the moment you got on this plane. Lisa couldn't believe what she was hearing. Intimidating? We haven't raised our voices or made any threats. We've been sitting quietly in our seats. The tall flight attendant seemed uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking. He had been watching the exchange, and it was clear that Jennifer's version of events didn't match what he was seeing. Ma'am, he said to Jennifer, maybe we should discuss this privately and let these passengers continue their flight. But Jennifer was too far gone to listen to reason. No, this needs to be handled now. These passengers have disrupted this flight, and they need to face consequences. She turned to David and Lisa with a look of triumph. I'm calling the captain. You're going to be removed from this aircraft as soon as we land, and there will be security waiting for you. The cabin fell silent. Even the background noise of the plane's engine seemed quieter as everyone processed what Jennifer had just said. Removed from the aircraft? Lisa repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. For asking for a blanket and trying to get a laptop? For being disruptive passengers who refused to follow crew instructions? Jennifer replied coldly. David knew. This had gone too far. As a civil rights lawyer, he understood that they were now facing not just embarrassment, but potential legal consequences based on false accusations. I want to speak to the captain myself, David said firmly. I want to file a formal complaint about how we're being treated. The captain doesn't have time to listen to complaints from problem passengers, Jennifer replied dismissively. The young woman with the phone held it up higher. I'm still recording all of this. Everyone can see. Exactly what's happening here? Jennifer glared at her. Put that phone away or you'll be the next passenger removed from this flight. For recording discrimination? The woman shot back. I don't think so. The businessman pulled out his own phone. You know what? I'm recording this too. This is wrong, and everyone should see it. Within moments, half the first-class passengers had their phones out. Jennifer looked around in panic as she realized that her behavior was being documented by multiple people from different angles. All of you stop recording immediately, she demanded, but her voice was shaking now. Why? Asked the elderly woman. Afraid people will see how you really treat passengers? Jennifer made one last desperate attempt to regain control of the situation. She looked directly at David and Lisa with an expression of pure hatred. People like you, she said, emphasizing each word, don't belong in first class. You should be grateful you're even allowed on this plane. The cabin went completely silent. Everyone understood exactly what Jennifer had just revealed about her true motivations. Even the two male flight attendants looked shocked at what their colleague had just said. David and Lisa sat frozen in their seats, the full weight of the discrimination they were facing now completely clear to everyone on the plane. The silence in the cabin was deafening after Jennifer's shocking comment. David felt his hands trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the controlled anger that comes from years of fighting injustice. Lisa sat beside him, her medical training, helping her stay calm even as her heart raced. David knew this situation had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. As a civil rights attorney, he had handled dozens of discrimination cases, but experiencing it firsthand was different. The humiliation, the anger, the feeling of helplessness. He understood now what his clients went through. He quietly pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found the number for his law firm's senior partner, Robert Chen. Robert was more than just his boss. He was a mentor who had been fighting civil rights cases for over 30 years. If anyone would know how to handle this situation, it was Robert. David stepped slightly into the aisle and dialed the number, keeping his voice low so Jennifer couldn't hear the conversation. "Robert, it's David Williams," he said when his mentor answered. "I'm on a flight to Los Angeles and I need your help. Lisa and I are being discriminated against by the flight crew, and it's escalating quickly." "Slow down, David." Robert's calm voice came through the phone. "Tell me exactly what's happening." David quickly explained the situation, from the initial request for a laptop to Jennifer's latest comment about people like them not belonging in first class. As he spoke, he could hear Robert's breathing become more controlled, a sign that the experienced lawyer was getting angry. "Do you have witnesses?" Robert asked. "Multiple passengers are recording everything. The whole first-class section saw it happen." "Good. Don't engage with the crew anymore. I'm calling the airline's corporate headquarters right now." "What airline and flight number?" David gave him the information, and Robert promised to call back within 15 minutes. As David hung up, he noticed Lisa was also on her phone, speaking in hushed tones. "Who are you calling?" he whispered. "Dr. Patricia Chen, at Children's Hospital in Los Angeles?" Lisa replied, covering the phone with her hand. "She's been trying to reach me about some award I'm supposed to receive. I figured I should let her know I might be delayed." Dr. Chen was the chief medical officer at one of the most prestigious children's hospitals in the country. Lisa had worked with her on several complex cases, including one just 2 months ago where Lisa had performed emergency surgery on a young boy who had been in a serious car accident. "Lisa, thank goodness I reached you." Dr. Chen's voice was excited. "I've been trying to call you all morning. You've been selected to receive the National Pediatric Excellence Award next week. It's a huge honor." "Thank you so much, Dr. Chen," Lisa said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'm actually on a flight right now and we're having some difficulties." "What kind of difficulties?" Lisa explained the situation, and Dr. Chen's tone immediately changed from excitement to concern. "This is absolutely unacceptable," Dr. Chen said firmly. "Lisa, do you remember the surgery you performed 2 months ago on the 8-year-old boy, Tommy Rodriguez?" "Of course. The emergency appendectomy with complications. Why?" "Tommy is the nephew of James Morrison, the CEO of the airline you're flying on right now. His family credits you with saving Tommy's life. James Morrison has been looking for a way to thank you personally." Lisa's eyes widened. She had no idea about the connection between her patient and the airline's leadership. "Dr. Chen, I don't want any special treatment because of a patient. That's not why I called. Lisa, this isn't about special treatment. This is about right and wrong. What you're describing is discrimination, and no one should have to endure that. I'm calling James Morrison right now." Meanwhile, David's phone was ringing. It was Robert calling back. "David, I just spoke with 3 different executives at the airline," Robert said, his voice serious. "They're horrified by what I've told them. Apparently, this flight attendant has had multiple complaints filed against her in the past 6 months, but somehow they weren't properly addressed. What happens now? The airline's vice president of customer relations is contacting the captain directly. They want this situation resolved immediately, and they want to apologize to you and Lisa personally." As David was finishing his call with Robert, passengers throughout the first-class cabin were busy on their own phones and social media. The young woman who had started recording was now live-streaming the entire situation on her social media accounts. "This is unbelievable, you guys," she was saying to her phone camera. "I'm on a flight right now where 2 passengers are being treated horribly by the flight crew for no reason. The discrimination is so obvious, and everyone can see it." The businessman across the aisle was typing furiously on his laptop, composing an email to his company's travel department about the incident. He had over 50,000 followers on his professional social media accounts and was already drafting a post about what he had witnessed. The elderly woman in the front row was on the phone with her daughter, a journalist for a major news network. "Honey, you need to hear about what I'm seeing on this airplane," she was saying. "This is the kind of story you report on." Within 30 minutes of Jennifer's discriminatory comment, the incident was spreading across multiple social media platforms. The hashtag #Dear Flight Discrimination was starting to trend, with passengers posting videos, photos, and detailed accounts of what they had witnessed. Jennifer, meanwhile, had retreated to the galley area with the two male flight attendants. They were having an intense whispered conversation, with Jennifer gesticulating wildly and the men looking increasingly uncomfortable. The shorter flight attendant kept glancing toward David and Lisa's seats, clearly realizing that the situation had spiraled far beyond what anyone had expected. The taller one was checking his phone, and his expression suggested he was reading something that concerned him. Lisa's phone rang again. It was Dr. Chen calling back. "Lisa, I just spoke with James Morrison personally. He's appalled by what's happening on his airline. He's immediately contacting the flight captain and ordering that you and your brother be treated with the utmost respect for the remainder of your flight. Dr. Chen, I really appreciate this, but I just want to be treated fairly, like any other passenger. That's exactly what you deserve, and that's exactly what you're going to get. James Morrison is also launching an immediate investigation into this flight attendant's behavior and the airline's complaint handling procedures." As Lisa was finishing her call, David noticed something happening at the front of the cabin. One of the male flight attendants was walking quickly toward the cockpit, looking urgent and concerned. The businessman across the aisle leaned over. "Something's happening. I just got a notification that this story is already being picked up by news outlets. My post has been shared over 1,000 times in the last 20 minutes. Other passengers were showing similar signs of the story going viral. People were getting notifications, phone calls, and messages from friends and family who had seen the posts online." Jennifer appeared from the galley looking pale and shaken. She was no longer the confident, aggressive person who had been harassing David and Lisa earlier. She walked quickly past their row without making eye contact, heading toward the back of the plane. The captain's voice suddenly came over the intercom, different from the routine announcements they had heard earlier. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. I need to address a situation that has occurred in our first-class cabin today." Every passenger on the plane fell silent, waiting to hear what the captain would say next. "It has come to my attention that 2 of our passengers have been treated inappropriately by a member of our flight crew. This behavior does not represent the values of our airline or the level of service our customers deserve." David and Lisa looked at each other in amazement. The captain was actually addressing their situation publicly. "I want to personally apologize to the passengers who were affected, and I want all of our customers to know that we are taking immediate action to address this situation." The transformation in the cabin was immediate and dramatic. What had started as a humiliating experience was turning into something completely different. The captain's announcement continued, and his words sent a wave of relief through the first-class cabin. "To ensure the comfort and safety of all passengers, we are making immediate changes to our crew assignments for the remainder of this flight. The flight attendant involved in this incident has been removed from active duty and will face a full investigation upon landing." David felt Lisa grab his hand. After hours of tension and humiliation, it felt surreal to hear the captain taking their side so publicly. Around them, other passengers were nodding in approval, and some were even clapping quietly. "Additionally," the captain continued, "our corporate headquarters has asked me to extend their personal apologies to the affected passengers. Representatives from our executive team will be waiting at the gate in Los Angeles to speak with them directly." Jennifer was nowhere to be seen. The 2 male flight attendants who had been with her earlier now approached David and Lisa's row, but their demeanor was completely different. They looked genuinely apologetic and professional. "Sir, ma'am," the taller attendant said, "we want to personally apologize for what you've experienced today. This is not how our airline operates, and it's not how any passenger should be treated." The shorter attendant nodded in agreement. "Is there anything we can do to make the rest of your flight more comfortable? We understand you originally asked for a laptop from the overhead bin. Please feel free to move around the cabin as needed." David stood up slowly, still processing the dramatic change in how they were being treated. He reached into the overhead compartment and retrieved his laptop without any incident. The simple action that had started this entire ordeal was now being encouraged by the same crew. "Thank you," David said simply. "We appreciate the apology." Lisa asked for the extra blanket she had originally requested, and it was brought to her, immediately with a warm smile. The contrast with Jennifer's earlier behavior was striking. The young woman who had been live-streaming the incident was still recording, but now her commentary had shifted. "This is amazing, you guys," she said to her phone camera. "The captain just made a public announcement apologizing to these passengers. The airline is actually doing the right thing here." Her live stream had attracted thousands of viewers, many of whom were commenting with their own experiences of discrimination while traveling. The incident was becoming more than just one story. It was opening up a larger conversation about how passengers should be treated. The businessman across the aisle was on a phone call with what sounded like a reporter. "Yes, I witnessed the entire thing," he was saying. "And yes, I'd be willing to go on record about what I saw." As the plane began its descent into Los Angeles, the atmosphere in the cabin had completely transformed. Passengers who had been strangers before were now talking to each other about what they had witnessed. Many exchanged contact information, offering to serve as witnesses if David and Lisa needed them. The elderly woman from the front row came back to speak with them personally. "I want you to know," she said, "that what happened to you was wrong, and I'm proud of how you handled yourselves. You showed more grace under pressure than I would have." "Thank you," Lisa replied. "Your support meant everything to us. I've been flying for 50 years, the woman continued, and I've seen discrimination before. But I've never seen passengers come together like this to stand up for what's right. You two started something important today." David's phone was buzzing, constantly with calls and messages. Robert, his law firm partner, had been fielding calls from news outlets wanting to interview David about the incident. Social media posts about the flight were being shared thousands of times, with many people praising the other passengers for standing up against discrimination. Lisa was getting messages from colleagues at the hospital who had seen the story online. Dr. Chen had sent her a text saying that the National Pediatric Excellence Award she was receiving would now have even more significance, as it was being given to someone who had shown courage both in medicine and in standing up for civil rights. As the plane touched down in Los Angeles, passengers began applauding, not just the usual clapping for a safe landing, but what felt like appreciation for everyone who had stood up for justice during the flight. When they reached the gate, David and Lisa gathered their belongings slowly, still processing everything that had happened. The other passengers made sure to say goodbye and offer their continued support. As they walked off the plane, they were greeted by a group of airline executives waiting at the gate. A woman in her 50s stepped forward with a warm but serious expression. "Mr. and Ms. Williams, I'm Patricia Rodriguez, Vice President of Customer Relations. On behalf of our entire airline, I want to offer you our deepest apologies for the unacceptable treatment you received today." Behind her stood two other executives and what appeared to be a customer service manager. This was clearly being taken seriously at the highest levels of the company. "We've already begun a full investigation into this incident," Ms. Rodriguez continued. "The flight attendant involved has been suspended pending the outcome, and we're reviewing all previous complaints that were filed against her." David and Lisa listened as she explained the immediate steps the airline was taking. Jennifer had been escorted off the plane by security and was facing potential termination. The airline was also implementing mandatory bias training for all flight crews within the next 30 days. "More importantly," Ms. Rodriguez said, "we're establishing a new rapid response system for discrimination complaints. When passengers report these incidents, they'll be investigated immediately, not filed away and forgotten." She handed them each a folder with information about the airline's new policies and a direct contact number for reporting any future issues. "We'd also like to offer you compensation for this experience," she continued. "Not because we think money can fix what happened, but because we want to show that we take this seriously." David and Lisa looked at each other. The money wasn't what mattered to them. It was the changes being made to prevent this from happening to other passengers. "We appreciate the apology and the policy changes," David said. "But we'd like to request that any compensation be donated to civil rights organizations that work on travel equality issues." Ms. Rodriguez smiled. "That's a beautiful gesture, and we'll be happy to make those donations in your names." Over the next few days, the incident continued to make headlines. News outlets interviewed the passengers who had witnessed and recorded the discrimination. The video footage went viral, with millions of views and thousands of comments from people sharing their own experiences. But the most important outcome was the change it sparked. Other airlines began reviewing their own complaint handling procedures. Flight attendant training programs added new sections on bias and discrimination. Travel equality became a topic of national conversation. 3 months later, David received a call from a young woman who had experienced similar discrimination on a different airline. But this time, when she filed a complaint, it was taken seriously, immediately. The airline investigated, apologized, and made changes to prevent future incidents. "I saw your story on the news," she told David. "It gave me courage to speak up when it happened to me. And because of the attention your case got, the airline actually listened." Lisa continued her medical career, receiving the National Pediatric Excellence Award at a ceremony that was attended by airline executives who praised her courage. In her acceptance speech, she talked about how standing up for justice was just as important as healing patients. David and Lisa's trip to their grandmother's 90th birthday party was a celebration not just of her long life, but of the change their courage had sparked. Their grandmother, who had lived through the civil rights movement, was proud of how her grandchildren had carried on the fight for equality. The flight that was supposed to be a simple trip to see family had become something much more significant. A reminder that ordinary people can create extraordinary change when they refuse to accept injustice.